Hello, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 4 today. The Masoretic text makes the first 3 verses of Daniel go with chapter 3. So it is a theological affirmation about the God of heaven. It's much like what Nebuchadnezzar did back in chapter 2 after Daniel interpreted the dream for him. Now, there have been several reasons why we think that Nebuchadnezzar did not personally pen these words. Now, we have some historical precedent, especially in the book of Esther, where Ahasuerus gave the right first to Haman and then to Mordecai to write laws in his name. So maybe what we have here is Daniel writing on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, there are some pagan elements here. So Daniel wrote what the king wanted him to, but Daniel put it in his own style. Because when you come to chapter 4, you don't see a different use of words or vocabulary or phrasing. So it seems that Daniel wrote it. Also, the theology of verse 3 is astounding. And maybe the king knew about it, but he didn't personally affirm it. It sounds like the theology of Daniel. Also, in verses 25 through 30, Daniel is mentioned in the third person. And then in verse 29, it seems to, just too much for Neo-Babylon, okay? So, I don't think Daniel wrote this totally excluded from the king, but I think Daniel and the king wrote this together, okay? Now, it's still in Aramaic. So let's look at it. Nebuchadnezzar, which means may Nebo protect the boundaries, the king of all the peoples, nations, and men of every language that live under all the earth. Now, that's a flowery way of saying the known world, not all the earth, okay? So it'd be the Mediterranean world that they knew and the kingdoms of the Tigris, Euphrates River that they had overcome, all right? May your peace abound. It seems good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. Now, the signs and wonders are what happened in chapters 2, 3, and going to happen in 4. All the tremendous things that God has done. God takes more time revealing himself to Nebuchadnezzar than any other ancient pagan king. I think God was trying to work with the man's heart. Now, W.A. Criswell and E.J. Young both believe that Nebuchadnezzar converts. But because down here of verse 8, and because all the cuneiform tablets we found attribute all of his success to Marduk, the chief god of the city of Babylon, I don't think he converted at all. Wish he did. I don't think he did. Now it says the Most High God. This is a much higher title than the God of heaven. It's used in verse 2, 17, 24, 25, and 32. It's the idea of the highest God. And so again, God is put at the chief of the pantheon. But for those who know God, he is the creator and everything else is created. Okay? Now it says, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. This is that same emphasis that he's going to set up a kingdom that'll never end. Now the millennial kingdom may be a part of this overarching kingdom, but this is not what's discussed here. You might want to see chapter 2, verse 44, chapter 4, verse 34, chapter 6, 26, and 7:14. This continuing emphasis on an eternal kingdom, not a temporal kingdom. And his dominion is from generation to generation. Now to me, this is the emphasis on the dual aspect of the covenant as being both corporate and individual. The generation to generation is the emphasis that every generation must choose for themselves to know and worship the God of heaven. And that's the ideal here. So it's both corporate, national Israel, but it's people within the nation that choose. And so biblical faith is only one generation away from extinction. If any one of us fumble the ball, it'll be gone. And I think it's important we hear that. We are a link in a historical chain of revelation. Verse 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. Now the word flourishing here is literally growing green, which seems to be an allusion to the dream that Daniel's going to interpret in chapter 4. It seems that this affirmation of verses 1 through 3, the Hebrew writers of the Masoretic text think it goes with chapter 3. But the English versions make this a prayer of thanksgiving for the dream interpreted in chapter 4. I saw a dream, and it made me frightful. And the fantasies as I lay on my bed and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. Remember back in chapter 2, we talked about the ancient Babylonian omen text that said if a man forgot a dream, it meant his gods were angry. Maybe some of that superstition was bothering Nebuchadnezzar. Notice he's going to call together all his wise men, the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, in verse 7. The question is, why did he just call Daniel? Well, it was a real slap in Nebuchadnezzar's face that his gods and his wise men couldn't interpret these dreams. He's going to have to call a Hebrew slave. Well, of course he wanted his wise men to get first crack at it. It had tickled him to death if they could have interpreted it, but they couldn't. It's the continuing emphasis that Yahweh is the God of gods, that these Babylonian gods who supposedly had defeated Yahweh couldn't reveal this at all, but Yahweh could. And his is the temple that's in ruins. It's to show the Jews that God is still in control of history. Now, notice it says, but they could not make it known. I've wondered some if they, we got to realize that there is power in darkness. Evil has some ability to ape or mimic the works of God. You see that in Pharaoh's magicians who copied many of Moses' plagues. Now, I'm not sure they couldn't interpret it. I think there is some power in evil. But if they could, they weren't about to tell the king the bad news that was coming. So either they couldn't know or they wouldn't tell. Now, which it is, I'm not real certain. But finally, Daniel, notice his Hebrew name, God is my judge, came in before me, whose name, notice it's Belteshazzar. Now let's look at that name for a minute. It seems to be protect his life. So there's a place for a God's name in front of that, but it's not included. Now some think it's may Baal protect his life, may Nebo protect his life, may Marduk protect his life. We're not sure. It may be a play on the word Belshazzar, so maybe a Baal, but Marduk was Nebuchadnezzar's favorite god, even though his name had the god Nebo in it, or Nebu. Well, we're just not sure. Since I know, and look at your translation now in verse 9, a spirit of the holy gods, plural. Now, the Hebrew is rather ambiguous here. This phrase can be singular, and that's what it is in Joshua 24:19. And it's used for polytheism in Genesis 41:38, back to Joseph again, who interpreted dreams in a similar manner. But now the word for God, or gods, is the word Elohim. Now in Hebrew, when you add im to a word, it makes it plural. El is the general name for God in this part of the world. So it's plural. Sometimes in the Bible that's translated simply as God. In the early parts of Genesis, word God is Elohim. Other places it refers to the angels, like in some of the Psalms. Psalm 2, I believe in Deuteronomy 33:2 it refers to the angels. But other times it's just a way of meaning the gods, plural. And so here it can either be singular or plural. Because the pronoun holy is plural, we see it in verse 8, 9, and 18. I think it's the plural. He's not saying the God has given you a spirit. He's saying you have a spirit of the gods. He's recognizing the divine nature of Daniel's gift, but not affirming monotheism. So, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians. Now, when I think of magician, I think of Kreskin pulling rabbits out of hats or making elephants disappear. That's unfortunate. A better translation, which the Peshitta, the ancient Syriac translation, has is scholars. The chief of the scholars, the wise men. That's the idea. Since I know that a spirit of the holy gods, he repeats it again, is in you, and that no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream which I have seen along this interpretation. It seems that verse 9, he's demanding that Daniel tell him the dream like he did back in chapter 2 and the interpretation. But in verses 10 and following, Nebuchadnezzar II is going to relay the dream to Daniel. Now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. This idea about a tree symbolizing a king's life or reign is very common in the ancient world. There's even some allusion in Greek literature to Philip of Macedon having a dream that a vine would grow out of the womb of one of his daughters and cover the whole earth. Well, of course, that is a prediction of the birth and campaigns of Alexander the Great, his son, from that very daughter. So it was a common way. Simply to say, God was speaking to Nebuchadnezzar in a way that Nebuchadnezzar could understand in symbols that related to his day. Now, the tree, now my New American Standard has grew large and became strong, but all the verbs through here are, in Hebrew, they're participles, or continuing to grow. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant, and in it was good food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, the birds of the sky dwelt under its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. Again, Nebuchadnezzar is used as a symbol of a world power, an effective, functioning world power. Now, this little phrase, the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches. If you have a reference Bible, you'll notice that this is used by Jesus in two different parables. This same little phrase, Matthew 13:32 and Luke 13:19. The parable of the mustard seed, little bitty seed that grows to a huge tree, this same allusion is used. Now, verse 13. I was looking in my vision, in my mind, as I lay on my bed, and behold, now look at your Bible in verse 13. My New American Standard has an angelic watcher. Now look, notice the word angelic. I think the New International has messenger. But remember, the word messenger in both Hebrew and Greek is the same word as angel. Now when it's italicized like that, it means it's not in the original text, but supplied for an English reader. So the translators of the New American Standard and the NIV believe it's an angel. Now the literal Hebrew here of the word watcher is one that stays awake. One that stays awake. This word watcher is only used in this chapter in the Bible. And it seems to be an angel here. The word is used in several other places. It's used in the non-canonical book of Jubilees and 1st Enoch for fallen angels. We found it in cave number 1 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the Genesis Apocryphon, it's used for angels, not fallen, but just angels, good or bad. And then this same word is used in the Canaanite pantheon for the messengers of the gods. Okay, now it's singular here in verse 13, but it's plural in verse 17. So I think that what we have here is another group of angels. Now these are known as the watching angels. They seem to be able to look at men and judge men on their own. Now maybe it's the idea of the angels of the nations, we find that in Daniel, or it's the idea of guardian angels over a large group, or we're just not sure. But it seems to be angels. And notice he shouted out and spoke as follows: chop down the tree, cut off its branches, strip off its foliage, scatter its fruit, let its beasts flee from under it, and the birds from its branches. Now if you have King James, every place I had the word it has the word his. Well, it's just we're talking about Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom, so you make it his, it's Nebuchadnezzar. The kingdom, if it's the same idea. Notice that this angel seems to make the decree himself. But if you look over at verse 34, it's God that makes the decree. Down in verse 17, it seems the angels are making this decree and executing this judgment. But if you read verse 34, it's God that's behind this decree of the angels. Now, notice it says, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground and with a band of iron and bronze around it. There's been much discussion about why this band of iron and bronze. There are many theories, but the only one that I think somehow fits the text is, some say they put the band on the stump to keep the stump from splitting and dying, because a shoot is going to come out of the stump. And so this idea of protection seems to be best. For it is highly unusual that Nebuchadnezzar is going to go insane for a period of time and that nobody is going to take over his kingdom. Now, he's going to be out there acting strange, and his servants are going to run his administration. And then he's going to come back to sanity again. And so I think this band is a symbol that God's going to protect his kingdom until he restores Nebuchadnezzar. Because you see, God is working with Nebuchadnezzar to show him that he is the one true God. Okay? Now notice in verse 16, let his mind be changed to that of changed from that of a man. Now the word mind is literally the Hebrew word heart. Now the Hebrews thought that the emotions, we use the word heart for emotion, but they put that in the lower viscera, the kidneys, the bowels. That's the phrase bowels of mercies, a place of emotions begin. But for the Hebrews, the word heart meant the center of man's personality, his thinking, choosing aspect. And so the word mind in English is very close to that Hebrew heart. Notice, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. Now, there's been much discussion with the 7 periods of time. Later on in Daniel, it's going to become very crucial how we interpret this Hebrew phrase. Most people, following the Septuagint, put the word 7 years, but we're not sure it's 7 years. Maybe 7 months, 7 seasons, 7 something, but we're not sure what. It seems to be 7 periods of time. Notice in Ecclesiastes 3, 2 and following, these 7 periods are not years at all, but simply seasons of life. The number 7 is the number of perfection, so it meant the complete time of God's judgment, whenever that was through. Now, the sentence is the decree of the angelic watchers, note the plural, and the decision is a command of the holy ones. Now, the holy one is in a parallel relationship to angelic watchers, so it simply means angels. But if you'll look at verse 24, it's God's decree that they act out. Now, the last part of verse 17 says, he sets over the lowest of men. You know, it's really a biblical theme that God brings down the proud and haughty and raises the humble. That's put in many different ways throughout the Bible, and he's doing that to Nebuchadnezzar. You might want to see 1 Samuel 2, 7 and 8 as one of many examples of this same idea throughout the Scriptures. The dream was right on, and obviously Belshazzar was going to be able to interpret it. So the king says that, interpret it for me. Now notice that when Daniel does this, there's no gifts given to him. The king wasn't real thrilled to hear this dream, right? So he didn't promise him more power. He was already very high in the government. Verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was appalled for a while. Now the Hebrew here means he stood speechless, maybe even the implication of his mouth opening and his face growing pale. Whatever else we believe about the relationship between Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, you'd think that Daniel would be mad at him. He was taken away from his family, his home city and God, his temple were destroyed. He may have been even physically castrated at the king's order. But for whatever reason, Daniel seems to be very loyal to Nebuchadnezzar and seems to have a real relationship of care and concern for this pagan king. The king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream and its interpretation alarm you. I guess as he stood there speechless, the king realized it was bad news, and he said, look, Daniel, tell me the truth. Don't worry about what you're going to have to say. You tell me the truth. And Daniel says, I wish it was going to happen to your enemies, O king, but here's what it means. And we'll begin. The tree that you saw, which became large and grew strong, whose heights reached the sky and was visible to all the earth, whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and whose branches the birds of the air lodged, it is you, O king. For you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And in fact, the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, notice there's that second title, descend from heaven saying, chop down the tree and destroy it. Now he goes through the same thing of the dream right through verse 26. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. And Daniel's going to say to this king, this is what's going to happen, king, but maybe you can put this off for a few years. Maybe you can postpone it if you will change your attitude and lifestyle toward the poor. For you see, the reason it was going to happen to the king is because of his pride and arrogance. Now, this verse 27 in the Septuagint, has been often quoted as a proof that man is saved by his works. They changed the word righteousness to the word almsgiving, or giving to the poor. Now, Daniel realizes that God is a moral God, and the universe is a moral universe. And so Daniel gives this pagan king some advice. It has nothing to do with this king's salvation, but it has to do with the postponement of the judgment that God's going to send because of his arrogance. This cannot be used as a proof text for works righteousness. Now, I do believe that works are important. We're not saved by works, but we are certainly saved unto good works. Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. I have a tape I've done on that called Faith and Works. It's both. But it's certainly not a way to be right with God. So Daniel's going to give him some advice about putting off this judgment. Break away from your sins. It means cast off this yoke. It's used that way in Genesis 27:40, okay? and by doing righteousness, and that means apparently helping the poor, and from your iniquities, and by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be prolonging of your prosperity. So Daniel's just saying, I think if you cool it with your pride and you begin to look at the lowly and downtrodden, ostracized, that God will have mercy on you, even as a pagan king. Well, verse 28, all this happened in Nebuchadnezzar the king, 12 months later. Now, whether it was that Nebuchadnezzar changed his life briefly, or whether God gave him that much time to see if he would, I don't know. But a year later, this happened to him. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of his royal palace in Babylon. That was the capital, Babylon. Now, the idea of roof is, the ancients usually, in the heat, they didn't have air conditioning. We know it gets 120 plus in this part of the world in the summer. They would go up on their roof. They would sleep up there. The wind, what wind there was cooler, and they just kind of lived on the roof in the summertime. That's apparently it's summer and the king was on the roof. In the wintertime, they'd go back downstairs where the house and the small windows would block the wind and build fires in there to keep some of the heat. So it's apparently summer, and he's up on the roof, and he's looking over the city of Babylon. It was a gorgeous city, a beautiful city. A matter of fact, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was Nebuchadnezzar is known for his building projects. He rebuilt many temples of Marduk, rebuilt many other temples and many cities and palaces. So he's really known as a builder. Now we learn from ancient sources and from archaeology, the city of Babylon had a double wall. The inner wall was 21 feet thick, 75 feet tall, with towers every 60 feet. Wow. The outer wall was 11 feet thick and 42 miles long. 6 foot outside the outer wall was a man-made moat that channeled the waters of the Tigris-Euphrates River. It was an astonishing. From archaeology, we found one of the gates of the city of Babylon, the gate of Ishtar, which was bright blue tile with inlays of a winged bull and a lion. Oh, it was gorgeous. Now, so the king has this thought about how great he really is. And when he thought, he didn't say it publicly, he just thought it in his mind. And when he did, while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, now this voice has caused people a lot of concern. In the interbiblical period from the close of Malachi around 430 BC until the coming of John the Baptist, there was no prophetic voice in Israel. So the rabbis developed what they call the Bath Koel, which is, if you had to know the will of God, that God would speak as a voice from heaven and let you know. Now, they had lost the Urim and the Thummim. They had no way of knowing God's will because there was no prophet, and so they're speaking. Now, we see it twice in the New Testament, when God speaks at Jesus' baptism and when God speaks at Jesus' transfiguration. But here it seems to be not God speaking, but one of these angelic watchers, okay, that the judgment has been confirmed. Now, Nebuchadnezzar remembers the dream and its interpretation, and when his sanity comes back, he's going to remember what Daniel told him. But this is going to come upon him. In verse 32, he's going to live out as the animals. Apparently, he lived in the palace enclosure, and the servants took what care they could of him, but they didn't lock him up or make fun of him. Now, in medical history, this is not uncommon. It's called Boanthropy. It's a person going insane thinking he's an animal. They eat grass. They stay outside. The werewolf legends are much like that. That's lycanthropy, thinking someone's a wolf. Now, it's not much common today, but it still happens some. And so Nebuchadnezzar is plagued with a common disease of man, thinking he's an animal. His hair is going to grow long and matted. His fingernails are going to grow like claws. He's going to stay out nights and dew and the cold. But at the end of that period, the 7 periods of time, Nebuchadnezzar raised his eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. Now, of course, who lives forever is a play on the Hebrew word Yahweh, the Hebrew verb to be from Exodus 3:14. And here, closing chapter 4, is the prayer of thanksgiving that Nebuchadnezzar gives to God for restoring him and for keeping his kingdom intact. It's very similar to the prayer that starts off chapter 4. So probably the first few verses of chapter 4 ought to go with chapter 3. And here we have a second prayer. Notice it mentions the same thing, the everlasting dominion, his kingdom from generation to generation. Notice the little phrase, the host of heaven, in verse 35. This is another title for God. There are several through here. We're going to find another in verse 37. I remember a while back I was singing "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and it came a little phrase, Lord Sabbath His name, and I kind of thought they'd misspell Lord Sabbath. But the word Sabbath or Sabbath means army captain, and that's the word host. So here we have God as the captain or military commander of the armies of heaven or of the heavenly council. And so knowing that Babylon worshiped the stars, here's another way of this king affirming that Yahweh is over all the gods of Babylon. And notice he's a military god. Even though his temple was destroyed, he was the commander of heaven. And then in verse 35 it says, and no one can ward off his hand. This is the word for child training or child discipline. And so we see an unusual word there, that God does what he wants to. His providence is sure, and no one can stop him. The gods of Babylon certainly can't. At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me. For the glory of my kingdom, my counselors, my nobles began seeking me out, and I was reestablished in my sovereignty, and the surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. There's that title. God has always been King of heaven. The Jews wanted an earthly king, but even the earthly king of Israel only represented the kingship of God of heaven. That's why he's called King of kings and Lord of lords. New Testament. That's why Jesus will be the returning King of kings, because he represents the God of heaven. For all his works are true and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. And that's what he did Nebuchadnezzar. Every one of these chapters, he's undercutting these powerful earthly kingdoms to show that he is God and he is in control. And boy, the Jews needed to hear that. I've enjoyed being with you. I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.